Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us again for another OSearch live virtual classroom. Today is going to be a very exciting class led by our education ambassador, Jen Cotton. And we have a very special guest today, Dr. David Gallo. Today we'll be talking about how organisms thrive in the deep, and we'll be learning from somebody who's actually been there before. So Dave, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Jen, thank you for joining us too.
Oh, anytime.
So just so everybody knows, there is a comment section right below this. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please use that comment box, and we will answer the questions as we can. The more on topic your question is, the better chance we'll have of being able to jump in and answer it. But really, I'm just super excited to get started with this one. So with that, Jen, I think I'm going to turn it over to you. You can introduce Dave a little bit more if you want, and the show is yours.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining in this week. I am beyond thrilled to have Dave Gallo join me today. As a marine science educator, this is one of the idols of mine. I show his Underwater Astonishments video on the very first day of my marine science course every single year as a precursor to some really cool things that they're going to learn. So if you have not seen that TED Talk, I highly, highly recommend checking that out immediately after this so that you can see some of the really cool things that he has discovered and seen in his lifetime. It's absolutely incredible to see all of the world below the waves. So definitely go check it out. Not only that, he's been to Titanic, which does not need any introduction. So he's one of the rock stars that we have the pleasure of having with us.
Thank you.
You are so welcome. So we are going to discuss life in the ocean. So we go from the top layer so often when we talk about, sharks swimming up and our sharks pinging and showing us tracking data. Well, all of that happens on the surface. And a lot of that begins with, it all begins with photosynthesis. And then we're going to go down each layer of the ocean until we make it to the very bottom, where we're going to discuss a process called chemosynthesis, which I'm going to let Dave explain in a little more detail since he's the one who's been down there. So we'll start by going over photosynthesis, what happens in the water. So at this level of secondary education, most of you have heard this term photosynthesis, but we're just going to give a quick little recap and kind of go over briefly how it functions in the ocean versus how it functions on land. So photosynthetic organisms are autotrophs, meaning that they make their own food or energy. They have chlorophyll, specifically chlorophyll A, which enables them to kind of complete this process of photosynthesis. So they're going to capture energy from the sun and convert it into a food source. I say food because it's more energy that they're creating. So the term photosynthesis, photo means light, synthesis means to put together. So photosynthesis is using light to put something together. Next slide, please. So in the ocean, we have this huge array of phytoplankton that is really the ones that are pumping out all the oxygen and creating and going through this process of photosynthesis. There's other, photosynthetic organisms, but phytoplankton really are the ones that are the most a range of these organisms. So phytoplankton is a microscopic organism that produce half of our oxygen here on Earth. They are the producers of the sea, and they really start that vast marine food web. And they produce more oxygen than the continents do. I mean, the ocean's 70% of the planet, so of course it's going to allow for us to have more oxygen than land. And it's really just due to the sheer amount of these organisms. So, stats have been thrown around and I use in my classroom is that every third breath you take, you can really thank these phytoplankton for creating it. Cyanobacteria is very important. They are the main contributing factor for photosynthesis in the ocean. We have estimated around 2,700 different types of cyanobacteria that are currently in the ocean that we've kind of discovered and put to a name. And they've been producing oxygen almost as long as Earth's been around. So roughly 3.5 billion years is the number that we kind of throw out there. So they've been producing all this oxygen for quite some time. So thanks to this tiny little plankton, there's plenty of oxygen in the atmosphere for us to breathe. Next slide. So we're going to talk about the different layers of the ocean. So it's not just one, consistent body of water. There's all kinds of different factors that are found in each different layer, and we're going to talk about them briefly. So light is different really depending on what layer you're at, and with that also heat and salinity, and there's a bunch of different abiotic factors that change throughout the water column. And with that, life's going to kind of function differently because of that. Next slide. So here you see all of the different layers. There's quite a bit, and it changes very, very quickly as far as how light functions. So the first layer, the epipelagic zone, we are also just going to call this sunlight zone since we have 7 through 12. You can call it whichever term you would like. Both are totally acceptable. And it's really just known as that sunlight zone because that's where most of the visible light is penetrating. With that comes heat, and this is responsible for a really wide range of temperatures that occur in this zone. So that sea surface temperature that our sharks like to follow around, this is that factor where they're kind of getting all of that different heat differentiation there. Then we have the mesopelagic zone. So you have also called the twilight zone. Light's going to be very faint here. This is where you're going to start seeing all those twinkly little bioluminescent organisms. And in some of the TED Talks that Dave does, he has really cool videos of all of those critters too that you can see. And there is a great diversity of really strange and bizarre looking fish that you can start finding there. Okay. Next, we have that midnight zone that we're going to get to, and these are where the only light that's really there is what's produced by the organisms that live there. So light's very, very thin. There's really no light available. Water pressure starts to become immense, and most of the animals that live here are black or red in color due to there being no light available. Okay, so now we have the abyssopelagic zone. So this comes from the Greek term meaning no bottom. So water temperature here is pretty much just freezing. There's no light at all. Very few creatures can be found at the current depths, and most of them are going to be invertebrates like basket stars, tiny squids, and 3/4 of the ocean floor really lies in this zone. Then we have the hydropelagic zone. It's basically freezing down here. More people have been to the moon than they have to this area, so it's not very well explored yet. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of this. Hopefully in the near future, we'll have some more expeditions out there. And the pressure, approximately, it's like having 48 Boeing 747 jets kind of pushing down on you. We do have some life down here still because life thrives in every single layer of the ocean. So we have some tube worms and some other really cool critters that we're going to look at here in a little while. So something I want to do to notice on this map, you can see to the right, it talks about the continental shelf, the slope, the rise, the ocean basin, as well as like trenches. So we're going to look at a map on the next slide.
Real quick, Dave, before we move on, Jen, I've got a quick question for Dave. Dave, you've actually been down through some of these layers, many of these layers. Can you describe to our audience what it's like to go down through them?
Well, if you're going, there's a couple of ways to explore that. One is the submarine, which is one of the coolest ways. So you get into basically a titanium sphere. Titanium is very strong and can withstand the ocean's pressure. And you have little portholes that are about that big, and about that thick. The windows are. So down you go, and at the surface, as Jen said, you have that lovely color blue, and there's fish, and there's sharks and whales and dolphins, and you can sometimes hear them. And then slowly you begin to drift down, and you go. It takes about a half an hour to get through that first zone of the light blue. Then it gets to darker blue. Then you're in the twilight zone. That's a really cool place, and actually got me goosebumped when Jen was talking about it, because at that zone, when you look out the window of the sub, you can kind of see things. Your brain's not sure. Am I really seeing something or not seeing something? It's a very strange place. But then you get down a little bit further, and a couple things happen quickly. It gets very cold. Up at the surface, the sun's been beating down on it, nice and warm, but down below this, where the sun ends off, really cold, just about freezing. And then you've got about 2 hours to go all the way down to the bottom. And we thought because it was pitch black, there wouldn't be much life in that world. As Jen said, you need light for the energy for life. But when we stop and look, we find at every layer, as Jen said, we find life. Life really wants to happen, but the animals are very bizarre. They have like lightning bugs or fireflies in your backyard. They all have their little lights, and there's green lights and red lights and blue lights and fireworks types of. It's fantastic all the way down. And I'm a geologist by training, so I can just ooh and ah. If I was a biologist, I'd have to be taking notes and being a real good scientist like that. And then you get to the bottom, and it's a very strange thing. In the sub, when you're just above the bottom on the way down, there's weights that helping you sink. You want to stop sinking, because the worst thing that could happen is you hit the bottom hard, the weights fall off, and then you go right back up to the surface. So before you get to the bottom, the sub slows down, and when you look out the porthole, you just start to see the bottom coming into view, and that's really cool, because you're probably, or you are, the first person to ever see that spot on Earth, probably the first person to see any of the animals that you're about to see. And so, in a way, it's a real privilege, because when you're down that deep, you don't know what to expect. It's just, we haven't been there before. So you're doing real basic exploration. And some of the animals are truly, truly weird. And then after about 5 hours, you drop the weights and slowly come back up to the surface through that zone again. So just the trip, the commute from the surface down through all those layers Jen talked about is fantastic. It's just an amazing privilege and a lot of fun too.
All right, so something that you can do is you can look at where our sharks are kind of hanging out. So if you've ever been onto our website, osearch.org, or even our app, you can notice that the map's not just, blue for water, green for land. There's a lot of texture happening. So right smack in the middle and right off the green area, you're going to see some seafloor features. And those are going to be that sunlit zone. And you can see how many sharks are really hanging out in that area just because the amount of organisms that are there thriving. So the sharks like to hang out in that area, and there are actually quite a bit of sharks that are down within each of these different layers. There's been quite a few videos that I've seen of like 6-gill sharks at the bottom, feeding on a whale carcass that's fall down there. So there's sharks within a wide range of different seafloor sea level layers. So, but you can see the majority of ours kind of hanging out right up there against that continental shelf. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about how, photosynthesis, it needs to have that presence of light. But what happens when you get deep down into the seafloor where there's an absence of light and there's total darkness? And that's where we're going to really have Dave come in and talk about things that he has seen, and we'll discuss a little bit more about chemosynthesis. So next slide, please.
Yep.
So Dave, if you can give us a little bit of information about some of the explorations you've been on, and how the type of life that's there, and specifically the black smokers that we're seeing here.
Yeah, the reason we call them black smokers, and there's an example of one, is because that looks like smoke coming out of what we call a chimney on the seafloor. And really that's happening. There's an underwater mountain range that goes right down. We used to think that if we go off the shelf that Jen showed, that lovely blue area, go across the oceans toward Europe or Africa, you might think that it gets deeper and deeper and deeper, but actually right in the middle of the ocean, there's a mountain range. So it goes deeper, deeper, than suddenly up. And on top of that, it's the greatest mountain range on Earth, but on the top of it, there's a valley. In that valley is where we find these black smokers. And the reason that's hot water coming out, it's not smoke, it's hot water, is because there's lava. That mountain range is one big long volcano. And that smoke or hot water, incredibly hot, like 700 degrees Fahrenheit, and very toxic, full of hydrogen sulfide and other things. It's that smelly, rotten, eggy kind of smell. But it would kill most of us, all of us, in a heartbeat. So incredibly toxic. Never been any sunlight. The pressure there is enough to actually crush the Titanic like an empty paper cup that, in your hand. And so we were positive that there'd be no life along that mountain range. And instead, we find abundant life. We find life that rivals the tropical rainforest. And what happens is that instead of sunlight, that's the energy source for photosynthesis, we have the chemical energies in bacteria that break down the bonds between some of the chemicals. And they make, through chemical energy, make sugars for for larger animals. And the larger animals there are in one spot, there's a good view of a chimney chugging away. There's a view of some of the animals that live around those chimneys that we never thought would exist. They're all almost alien type structures, animals. They have no digestive system, some of them. They're just full of bacteria, but they're thriving. And, that's the amazing thing, was that we never knew chemosynthesis played such a large part in life on Earth. And so in one moment of exploration, it was never predicted. That mountain range wasn't predicted. The hot smokers were never predicted. And the life there was never predicted. In fact, some of the biologists thought that, it couldn't possibly happen. And so in one moment of exploration, where we went there for the first time, revolutionized the way we think about life on Earth and other planets. What you see now is pretty cool. That's an underwater lake, the shoreline of an underwater lake. You see waves in it. That's another place. Those animals on the left, they're mussels, there's shrimp inside there. There's all sorts of other animals along that shoreline, but that's the bottom of the ocean. So in this case, you go down to the bottom, land on sediments on the bottom of the ocean or mud, and drive along, and all of a sudden you look out the window and there's a shoreline with more water at the bottom of the ocean. And it's so neat that there's actually waves in that water, and there's life that lives in that water that doesn't come up into the ocean, and life in the ocean doesn't go down in that water. But again, what you're looking at here is chemosynthesis, chemical energy on the right, and the animals on the left have a bacteria that munches on the chemical energy, turns it into sugar for the larger animals. So really cool. Once again, never predicted, but now that we know they're there, we can search for them. We know to look for them, so we're finding lots of those now.
So this week we're celebrating Earth Day. So I call it Earth Week. It's the whole week we celebrate leading up to Earth Day, and we're the tail end of it with Earth Day being yesterday. So we can't go through this week without talking about the human impact pieces. So we have a couple of images here. The one on the right was a bottle that was actually picked up on one of our expeditions, and you can see that it's just covered with some life. So it was discarded at some point, and it was out there long enough for little fouling creatures to grow on it. So I believe those are some gooseneck barnacles, and it looks like some algae that has grown on this bottle that's been out in the water for quite some time. And eventually, this bottle will photodegrade, so it's going to break down and weather due to light and just being pushed around with the waves. And it's going to turn into microplastics, which is what we're going to focus on a lot next week. But the image on the left, that was actually taken down towards at the bottom of the sea. So Dave, can you talk a little bit about, pollution down in the bottom of the ocean, or have...
Sure. Yeah, I mean, some people think that because the oceans are so big and so deep that we can't possibly poison them or affect them. And they make some excuses about, well, there's natural rhythms and cycles. But when you go out to the middle of the ocean, like the middle of the Pacific Ocean, you catch a fish. If you look at the stomach contents of that fish, you'll find these little bits of microplastics, like Jen mentioned, in the stomach of that fish. If you look in the flesh, you'll find things like fertilizers, pesticides, things that kill bugs, pharmaceuticals, different kinds of chemicals, all human-made stuff, fire retardants, that's a big one that we're finding now. And so basically, this is incredible. Even in the middle of the ocean, we're kind of eating our own garbage. Really disgusting. And I mentioned going to the bottom for the first time, seeing something neat on the bottom, unpredictable. One thing we see no matter where we go, no matter what expeditions, at least the ones I've been on, is the evidence of human behavior. We see trash. Maybe not a lot in some places, but we see some evidence of human behavior. And honestly, it's disgusting. So the good news is that now we know. So we need to stop on land, do everything we can to stop polluting the oceans. And also we need to find a way to clean up the oceans. The amount of stuff that's in there already. So microplastics and plastics, huge problem, as well as all those other different chemicals that go down the rivers and out to sea.
Well, and another misconception I know some of my students have is it's not just floating at the top or sinking to the bottom. Plastics and other, human-made pollution, it all has different densities, so it can be within the entire water column. Yep. It's not just floating up where we can scoop it up, or just sinking to the bottom where we could figure out how to clean up the sand down there and the sediment. It is in the entire water column. So it's a big undertaking, but the more that you cut back and, do your part and reduce your single-use items or make smart choices as far as like fertilizers, like Dave was saying, heavy metal runoff is another huge issue. Using cleaning up after your pets and not allowing those nutrients to go into the water. There's a great deal of things that we can do as an individual to help with this issue. Single-use plastics, that's the easiest thing that you can do at home, is to cut back on using those. You probably have seen, let's not use the plastic straw, let's use a reusable shopping bag. Yeah, those are very easy things that you can make a change with. So just do your part, and if everybody just does a little bit at a time, we can work towards chipping away at this problem.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I always think, sometimes we look for big solutions that whole countries are going to do something incredible. But Jen's absolutely right. It's these baby steps, if you want to call it that. It's local behavior that can add up to a big change. It certainly changes our mindset, but that actually can have an impact in the ocean. I mean, I live there's a pond not far from where I'm sitting now, maybe football field away. But even here, some of the homes around here, a lot of scientists live around here, still put a lot of pesticides and fertilizer on their yards. It goes right into the pond, and then with the tide goes right out to sea. It's really, we have a lot to learn, but you can make a difference, a big difference, if you decide to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, and our first one that we did, we talked about dead zones and how all drains, lead to the ocean. So no matter where you're at, even if you're up in the middle of the United States, you still going to make an impact on the sea. So everybody do a little bit at a time, and let's see how far that we can go together as a society. So our next slide, we do have a little activity for you guys. Every week we have a STEM activity that you can do at home. We did go ahead. John, you sent this out to everybody, correct? Or you will send this out because it's a little small.
Yeah, I'll put. I didn't actually get around. You sent it to me, so that was my fault. Sorry, Jen, but I will. Everybody, you'll have this link. The download button will go to this activity if you want to do it at home.
All right, thank you. Just because it's a little small. Normally, I like to create these so you can take a little picture of it. You can still do that by any means. Just feel free. So we're going to look, I just told you, different densities of plastics in the ocean. We're going to look at creating layers of the ocean by essentially creating a density column. So you may have done this before in school, but we're going to specifically do it mimicking the layers of the ocean. And then I have some follow-up questions for you that might, that'll help you shed a little bit more light on the science behind this. So I gave you some basic materials that you can find at home. I tried to find an alternative for corn syrup just in case, because that's less of a common household item, but I really couldn't find one that was a suitable replacement, and I'm sorry for that. Hopefully you can make it work. Maybe if you get out to the grocery store, you guys can grab that. But dish soap, it says blue, but really any color, because you're going to need blue and green food coloring, so you can add colors to it as well. Let me start from the beginning. I went ahead of myself. So you need just a glass jar. Anything can work. If you have an old pasta jar, a mason jar, anything that can hold 3 layers of liquid that's see-through, you can use. Blue and green food coloring, which will make sense in a little bit. Like I said, half a cup of corn syrup, half a cup of all of the liquid. So corn syrup, dish soap, vegetable oil, water, rubbing alcohol. If you have a funnel, if not, don't worry about it. Just pour it over the sink so that you don't make a giant mess. You can use labels if you'd like, or you could just write straight onto the glass jar. I just used tape and a marker I had to create mine that I'm going to show you. And then a flashlight. And also most cell phones have a flashlight available. So if you don't have a flashlight at home, you can go ahead and use the flashlight on your phone to achieve this as well. So your directions, it asks you to pour the materials from steps 3 through 7 into separate bowls, just so that you can add coloring to each layer. So you're going to add a lot of blue food coloring and a few drops of green to the corn syrup to make it a very dark color, and you're going to pour that into your jar. Then you're going to do the same things with each of the following ones. So you're going to do your dish soap. You can add a couple of blue to it to make it a little bit darker. Then your, but not as dark as your corn syrup. So you're going to lighten it up a little bit. Then you're going to add it to the water. Again, be mindful that it's a tad lighter than your dish soap. Then you're going to add your vegetable oil. So vegetable oil doesn't like to play nicely with other substances, so you can't add coloring to this. And we all understand that the ocean is not going to be this yellow color, but it also it's lighter, but not as light as the following layer. So it works for our layer here. Finally, you're going to add your rubbing alcohol. Make sure you add this very slowly. Next slide, please. So what you end up with is this little column where you have all of your different layers of the ocean. So you can go ahead and label them. I put just the generic terms for it. If you would like the scientific terms for it, you can see that at the beginning of the PowerPoint slide again. Otherwise, a very quick Google search as well will provide those for you. So what you're going to do is you're going to use your little flashlight and kind of hold it up to each layer and just see how much light passes through, and then take some notes of what you're seeing.
So just so everybody knows, I did update the download button on this page so that this activity is now available. So while Jen was yelling through that, I made this available for everybody. Dave, curious, your thoughts on this little visualization. Does it, how close is it to what you've seen in person?
Yeah, I'm going to do that. I am. Because I love it, because it's one way we can explain those underwater lakes or ponds is that how can you have at the bottom of the ocean another layer of water in the water? And this explains it perfectly that you can do that. And, it's a great way to look at it. And I think these kinds of things really help, because once you do it, you get it and you can understand it. And you can explain it to other people too, that the ocean is like that. The layers, we used to think that most of the life was right up on top. And then little by little, scientists are coming back with the ideas that some marine mammals, not just whales, but sea lions and the like walruses, are going deeper and deeper and deeper. And especially with certain pilot whales, I think it is, that we noticed that they were going down to 1,000 meters into these layers, which is really deep. And we thought, well, maybe they're trying to avoid predators or something like that. And then someone finally saw one come to the surface, and it had a squid tentacle in its mouth. And so what we found out was that they're going down there chasing giant squid. And there's not just giant squid. There's all sorts of animals in this layer deep in the sea where we never expected that kind of density of life to be. So I think this is a good way to explain it, that to know that there's layer. It's not a big blue fishbowl. There's lots of stuff going on in the ocean. That's a good way to explain it.
And some of the follow-up questions, it allows for them to dig a little deeper into those as well. So I'm like asking them, looking up how deep each layer is, looking at the influence that light has on the life, what type of organisms do you expect to see, how would temperature be affected by depth at each layer, and then, how would chemosynthesis differ from photosynthesis. So it's going to have you venture a little deeper into each layer and do some of your own investigations as a citizen scientist. So you guys can get a really nice grasp on each layer and how different it is depending on where you're at.
Yeah, one thing I noticed by looking at this too is how dark it looks at the very bottom. And you might say, well, we say that's the most extreme environment on Earth. Incredible pressure, incredibly cold, some places incredibly hot, earthquakes, volcanoes. But actually, when you think about it, those places are fairly stable. They don't have to worry about hurricanes, floods, droughts. We're the ones, so it's fairly stable. We're the ones up here in the light that have to worry about all that other stuff. What happens with volcanic eruptions, what happens with earthquakes, what happens with hurricanes, floods, droughts. So we're actually the ones, if you had to look at it from the bacteria point of view, we're the knuckleheads that came out here out of the water up into this world where we have to worry about all the things you don't have to worry about as an animal on the bottom of the sea.
I'm curious, Dave, you were talking about extreme conditions down there. What are the temperatures down low? Are they below freezing? And because it's so salty, or?
Well, sure. Yeah. You go through, so again, at the surface, especially if you're diving in the tropics where the sea levels tends to be very calm, can be very calm. At the surface, incredibly hot, 90 plus degrees, and inside the sub, you start out wearing shorts and a t-shirt, a lot of sweating going on because you're in a little metal sphere that's been out in the sun for hours. Then you begin your way down and the light fades away. And as I said, once you get below into that dark layer, past the twilight zone, boom, just like that, you're turning the light and the heat off. So you start to freeze. You're starting to die of hypothermia, really. So on comes the hoodies and sweatpants and the like, and then you continue down to the bottom. Pretty much that ocean for a couple of miles is pretty much the same temperature, not exactly, but it's just above freezing. When you get to the bottom, in certain places it can be a little bit warmer, but generally it's just above freezing again, 34, 35, 36 degrees, 40 degrees, something like that. Except when you get to those hot vents, the volcanic areas, where the temperature can go rocketing up to 700 degrees. It doesn't, hot vent is here, and maybe actually they're about that wide. And 700 degrees Fahrenheit, it would burn instantly through the portholes of Alvin, or submarine, like the submarine Alvin, and you would die in an instant. In fact, the first time one was seen, they put a temperature probe into it, it melted the probe. So, but oddly enough, you can come right up to that, probably that far away with the submarine, because it's so cold in the ocean that the heat only goes from here to there. So just like if you're seeing a fire in a fireplace at home, you can it gets warm, but it's not really dangerous until you get right into it. Same thing with these hot vents. So there it's fairly warm, lukewarm, but generally once you get below the sunlight, it's just above freezing. Big difference is where there's, we call them currents, but they're actually rivers that run through the ocean. Some of them are hot, rivers warm, like the Gulf Stream. That happens because it's warm, it's buoyant, happens way up at the surface. But there's also deep water currents that wiggle across the bottom the same way a river does on land, and those tend to be very cold and salty. So again, it's not a big blue fishbowl, and everything we have on land, mountains, valleys, rivers, waterfalls, lakes, we find in the ocean. And we're just beginning to understand it. We explored way less than 10%. And we found all this neat stuff. So you have to wonder what's in the other 90%, so it's pretty cool.
Jen, did you want me to jump into some of the questions here, or did you have more that you?
No, you can go ahead and start with questions.
I guess maybe this is one that actually just came in. Dave, can you maybe explain some of the biggest differences between the abyss and the trench
Sure.
layers? Yeah,
well, the abyss, there's a part of the ocean that abyss can be 5,000 meters and a bit shallower. In the ocean, the abyss, we call them the abyssal plains. A lot of the ocean floor is just absolutely flat. There's sediments there that haven't been bothered for a long, long, long time. There you go. So the flattest places on Earth. When you get into the trenches, it goes really quickly. And most of the ocean is not trenches. The trenches are very little bit of the ocean, but they get deep very quickly, down to 11,000 meters. And that's, if you look up in the sky and you see a jet going past with a vapor trail out the back, that's 11,000 meters. So that's the full depth of the ocean. And the one thing that's obvious is the incredible pressure. The other thing is that it's an active tectonic zone, meaning there's volcanoes and earthquakes, because in that case, what makes the trench is big plates of the earth, one going underneath one another, and that going underneath makes the trench. So you have earthquakes, landslides, things like that, very dynamic place. And again, as Jen mentioned, even in the trenches where we thought it's too deep, it's too dark, you think we'd learn our lesson by saying, well, we don't think there'll be life. If someone says that, that's the first place you should look for life, because we've been wrong about that time and time again, that there is life inside the trenches. And it's only been visited a couple times. Way back in the 60s, it was visited. And James Cameron went with his one-person submarine, and now there's a couple of other subs and robots that can go down there. But altogether, maybe 20 visits to the trenches. So we really don't know much about them at all, except that they're pretty exciting places. But again, very different from the shallowest places on Earth to some of the most rugged, deep holes in the Earth. That's the biggest difference.
Cool. Another question here has to do with some of the tools that you use for exploring the bottom of the ocean. You're in a submarine, but there's more ways to explore the bottom of the ocean. Can you explain how the bulk of it is done and what some of the tools are you use?
The first thing we had to explore the bottom of the ocean, well, way back when, we used you would lower a dredge over the side and literally see what comes up, or a net, and see what comes up inside that net. So that's one way to explore. But now in the modern age, we had the submarine that first showed up, and an echo sounder, meaning we made a sound on a ship, the sound went down, bounced back up, and by knowing how long it took, you can guess, how fast the sound goes through the water. So that's pretty good. You can tell how deep it is. And instead of pulling a net through the ocean, now we've got cameras that can take images like you see on the screen right now. Incredibly detailed, beautiful colors. That's a robot. That's a submarine right there. You'll see a robot a little bit later. Submarine is good because it puts you, the scientist, or you, the explorer, down there in the environment. You can't stay very long. It's kind of uncomfortable. It's kind of like going to a live sports event, a football game or a soccer game or something like that. There's a robot down on the bottom. Robots go a long time. They can stay down there days, weeks, maybe even a month at a time. But again, so the playoff is, one, to actually be there, like to be at that live sporting event, or to watch it from home. Home's comfortable. You can watch it on the screen. You can go to the bathroom, all that stuff. So it's both of those tools. We call them platforms. The platforms are submarine and robot, different variations of each. But then you have the sensors, which are typically cameras and sonars, make sound, discover what's around you, and chemical sensors. All that stuff, by the way, has got to be built specially to go to the pressure of the deep ocean. So we have to protect all the electronics. And I'd like to think my neighbor across the street is a space shuttle astronaut, Sunita Williams. And I used to joke with her that from here to Mars, it's only 1 atmosphere of pressure difference from here to Mars. But from here down to the bottom of the trenches, it's like 11,000 atmospheres, 1,000 atmospheres difference. So the pressure is immense. So you've got to build cameras and things like that to be able to go down to the bottom of the sea. Other thing is, you can't use radios at the bottom of the ocean. We have to talk. If you want to talk back and forth, it has to be typically through sound. So all the things that make it easy to explore up here under the sun, we don't have at the bottom of the sea.
So you by sound, you mean like via wires?
No, actually, we used phones that you talk with, that sends your voice through the sound, just like whales would communicate, or marine mammals would communicate. And so typically you can't send a lot of information that way, and it's garbled. Usually it's just done to let you know that they'll ping the sub if it's a submarine, and the sub will say we're okay. So it's usually that simple. The other thing, you can't really use it for data to send images back, although we're getting better at that. Or you use sound to find out where something is on the bottom, because we don't have GPS on the bottom either. We have to locate ourselves typically with sound. You put these things called transponders on the bottom of the ocean, just like we do cell towers. And by knowing which ones we're using, we can tell roughly where we are on the bottom of the sea. So sound's important. Sound goes a long way under the water. Light does not.
Thanks. Sorry, that was my question. That wasn't a viewer question. I got selfish and jumped in with one. So thank you for taking my question.
Sure.
But I will jump back to another one here. I think people are seeing some of the stuff that you're from the bottom of the ocean, but there is no light. So those are lights coming off of the submarine or the robot, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Some of that is refraction from our own lights, but almost all animals there like that. have got their own lights. They make it through chemicals just the same way as fireflies or lightning bugs do in your backyard. It's the same kind of thing, except the range is fantastic. So if you turn out the lights on the sub and just go slowly through that dark world, all these animals can feel the presence of the sub, so they light up. And like I said earlier, some are, you see like fireworks, and some are blinking green, and some are yellow and orange and shooting stars. So and if you turn the lights on, all you see is like a little funny kind of soup, but the lights off, you get an incredible show.
So we are running a little bit low on time, but there were a couple of questions about this, so you don't have to go into too much depth. There were some people curious about your exploration of the Titanic. Can you just real briefly? Yes.
Sure.
Jen didn't go to the Titanic. Oh, I thought you were asking me. I was like, no, Jen didn't go to the Titanic.
I will gladly go to the Titanic next time you go.
Okay.
Yeah. Just real quick, why you went, what you found, and
yeah. I didn't, when I came to Woods Hole was 30 years ago, right after Titanic was discovered. And I worked with Bob Ballard. I was his assistant director, the guy that found Titanic. So I was part of that team. And I kept Titanic away because it wasn't science. I was working on science, understanding that underwater mountain range. But little by little, I got to, because I was always around Titanic, I would see these stories and these tricks and problems. And how do you explore a shipwreck at the bottom of the sea? What do we find? How do you look inside the cabins? How do you take care of something? How long will Titanic be there? And by 2010, Titanic had its grip on me completely. So that bookshelf behind me is full of books about like this. I've got a whole set of books like this about how Titanic was built. And so it's just amazing that there's so many stories on Titanic about the ship itself, that age of elegance, but also about the people that lived and sailed and died on. Some of them died, some of them lived. Stories of the people. And so we're like detectives that when we go out to sea, like Sherlock Holmes's, that we go out there and try to collect clues and how the ship really sank, what the passengers really did tell us about their life. All those things are evidences that we find by going down and exploring Titanic. We're not nearly done understanding that wreck and being able to keep the legacy of the ship and honoring the people that died and sailed on her alive. Yeah.
Very good. We're kind of running up against time here, but Jen, I did want to give you a chance to ask Dave if you had any questions before we sign off, since you said you're such an admirer.
Mainly for my students who, kind of look up to people like you. When I was in high school, following the work that Bob Ballard and you were doing, and it's really inspiring to know that things are possible. So, going down to the deep sea, and a lot of this it didn't seem like something that would necessarily be possible. So I guess what do you think is the future of ocean exploration? Because that's a huge unit that I cover, is just technology and exploration.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned before, and you brought this up, Jen, the oceans are very important to us. They give us fresh air, oxygen. They provide us with almost all the rainwater we have. So it's the air we breathe, the water we drink, and for 2 billion people, the food they eat. And we love seafood too. Mm-hmm. And yet we haven't even explored. We need to protect the ocean, because if we kill the ocean, we kill ourselves. But before we can protect it, we need to know about it. And that's where exploration comes in. We explore, we understand, and then we take action. And so we're just kicking off, like I said, with the pollution. Now we know. So I think the coming ages, you're going to see more importance on the ocean. Like, for instance, China decided 10 years ago that they were going to be one of the leaders in ocean exploration because they recognize the power of that. And they're doing it. They've got new subs, new robots. They're funding all sorts of students. I think that one way what happened to me was I wasn't a great student, but when I heard more about the oceans, it's like flipping a switch that I said, that's what I want to do. And so it got my passion going. And I never gave up, never looked back. And the ocean will do that to you. There's so many things, and there's biology, there's chemistry, there's the waves, there's tsunamis, there's rogue waves, there's giant fish, tiny fish, something for everybody. And what I would recommend to you is find your passion. It doesn't have to be oceans, but if you're interested in exploring, what a great place to explore. But find your passion, keep that passion going. And then, be a pest. And I mean that in the best way, that find someone doing the research you want to do that interests you and send them an email, get on their mind so they know you're out there. I promise you that it'll be appreciated. Having it, some of my most things, I've got a bunch of awards over there behind me. Those are all great and important, but what's even more important to me is getting a letter from some student saying, I really like what you do. I want to do that too. That's fantastic. That's a win for me. So be that person, just take charge. Don't let anyone tell you there's no jobs in oceanography or science, or that everything's been done already, because that's absolutely not true. There's plenty to do, and it's going to be up to you to do it.
Thank you so much for that.
Dave, thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who joined. I mean, Dave, that was an absolute pleasure having you be part of this. We're so glad you could make it.
My pleasure.
Just so that everybody knows, thank you all for being here. We are going to continue to do these online STEM classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So keep an eye out on all of OSearch's social media channels. That's where we'll be letting people know. Keep an eye on your email. We'll also be letting you know there. As we're all learning from home, we'll keep this kind of stuff going. We'll have other great guests. I don't know if they'll be as great as Dave, because that was truly special. But we've got some really exciting people coming too. So thank you to everybody for joining. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Jen. And with that, I think we will sign off. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.